The finger that pointed at Henrietta was steady. That was what she would never forget. Not the words, not the silence that followed, not the sound of 30 people inhaling at once. The finger, steady as a bayonet, aimed with the same intent. You were bought, not chosen. The Dowager Duchess of Dunmore said it clearly in the middle of the Dunmore drawing room on the evening of Henrietta's arrival as the new bride. She said it the way people say things they have been waiting a long time to say. Slowly, with satisfaction. Then she raised her finger and added the rest, and the rest was worse. And the family that sold you to us has the blood of my brother on its hands. I will not pretend otherwise for the sake of a vow made by a man who is no longer alive to be held accountable for it. Every candle in that room seemed to hold its breath. Every face turned, and Henrietta, 22 years old, 48 hours married, still wearing the dust of the road on her travelling cloak, stood in the doorway of a house that was now legally hers, and felt the floor shift beneath her like ice beginning to crack. She did not fall. She had made a private promise to herself at her father's graveside 3 weeks ago that she would not fall, and she intended to keep it, but she had not known it would begin this quickly. Her father, Lord Bassett, had died in October, 6 weeks after the accusation appeared in print. The accusation had been specific and devastating. It claimed that during the Peninsula campaigns, Lord Bassett, then serving in a minor diplomatic capacity, had passed intelligence to a French contact. That intelligence, the report alleged, had enabled a French ambush on a British regiment in the hills above Salamanca. 14 men had not come home from those hills. One of them was Captain George Hartley, the Dowager's only brother, and the man she had loved most completely in a life that had not offered her many people to love. The accusation had never been proven. It had also never been disproven because Lord Bassett had been too ill to defend himself and too proud to beg anyone to defend him. And he had died with the accusation still hanging over his name like smoke over a ruined house. Henrietta had sat beside his bed in those final weeks and watched him diminish, and on the last clear evening he had taken her hand and said, very quietly, with the urgency of a man who knows his remaining hours are few, "I never gave them anything. You must believe that. Whatever they say, whatever comes after, I never gave them a single word." He had told her she believed him. She had believed him with her whole heart. She believed him still. But belief, she was learning, required no evidence, and evidence was the only currency the world accepted. Charles Dunmore had been her father's friend's son. That was the simple version. The longer version was this. Charles's father, the late Duke, and Lord Bassett had been young men together at Oxford, and the friendship that formed there had been the kind that does not require frequent contact to remain true. They had corresponded for 30 years. They had seen each other perhaps a dozen times in that span, but those meetings had had the particular quality of time between people who know each other at the level, beneath performance, beneath rank, beneath everything society requires them to be. When Charles's father lay dying, 2 years before Lord Bassett did the same, he had asked for one thing from the friend who came to sit with him, that the children should marry. That, whatever came, the friendship should continue in the next generation. Lord Bassett had given his word without hesitation, because that was the kind of man he was, and because he had believed then that his name was still worth something. Charles had honoured the vow, not because he was forced to, not because there was profit in it, but because his father had asked it of him with his last coherent breath, and Charles Dunmore was, at his core, a man who understood that loyalty to the dead was not sentiment. It was character. He had known about the accusation before the marriage. He had known about the Salamanca intelligence report, and his uncle George's death, and his mother's conviction that the Bassett family bore responsibility for it. He had sat with all of it for weeks, and turned it in his mind the way you turn a complicated object in your hands, examining every angle, looking for the truth beneath the shape. He had not yet found the truth, But he had found Henrietta, which was a different matter entirely. He had met her twice before the wedding, briefly, formally, in the presence of her aunt, who had managed the arrangements after her father's death. He had watched her handle those meetings with a composure he recognized as costly, because he had spent enough time wearing composure as armor to know what it looked like on someone who had put it on that morning and was not sure it would last the day. He had thought of what his father had taught him, that a person's family was not their character, that inherited circumstance was not personal guilt, that the only fair assessment of any human being was the one made from watching them choose, under pressure, who they were going to be. He had chosen to proceed. His mother had not spoken to him for 11 days after he told her. Now, standing in the doorway of his own drawing room with his new wife beside him, Charles looked at his mother across the assembled household with an expression that those who knew him well would have identified as the outermost edge of his patience. "Mother," he said, and the single word carried enough weight to stop a lesser argument cold. "She has a right to know what she has married into," the dowager said, her voice still steady, still pointed, but something in it shifting slightly at the sound of his tone. "She has a right to know what this family has suffered." "She does," Charles said, "and I will tell her at the appropriate time in the appropriate manner, which is not this." He looked at the assembled staff, at the housekeeper and the footman, and the faces arranged in the frozen attentiveness of people pretending very hard not to be witnesses to something. "That will be all for the evening. Thank you." The room emptied with the swift, silent efficiency of a well-trained household. The dowager remained, Henrietta remained, and Charles stood between them like a man who has chosen his ground and intends to hold it. The dowager looked at her son for a long moment. Then she looked at Henrietta with the flat assessing gaze of a woman who has already decided what she is looking at. Then she left the room. Her footsteps on the marble were perfectly even. She did not slam the door. She had too much self-command to slam doors, but the closing of it had a finality that said everything the slam would have said. Charles turned to Henrietta. She was still standing precisely as she had been standing since the dowager's finger found her, hands quiet, chin level, expression arranged in the composure she had brought with her and clearly intended to keep. "I am sorry," he said. "That should not have been your welcome." "No," she said, "it should not have." A pause, "but I think I understand why it was." He looked at her carefully. "You know about your father's accusation." "My father told me everything that had been alleged. He also told me it was false." She met his eyes directly, without flinching and without pleading. "I believed him. I still believe him. I thought you should know that immediately, so that we do not spend the first weeks of this marriage pretending I am unaware of what stands between your family and mine." Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father believed yours. He never withdrew his friendship or the vow, not even after George died, not even after my mother's certainty about who was responsible. He said that a man's word given in grief was not the same as evidence and that he would not treat it as such." A pause. "I intend to hold the same position." Henrietta looked at him. She had prepared herself for many versions of this man, all of them difficult, none of them this. She had not prepared herself for someone who led with fairness. "Then we have somewhere to begin," she said. They began there. The weeks that followed were not peaceful, but they were purposeful. Henrietta learned Dunmore House the way she learned everything, methodically, attentively, without making a performance of it. She learned the staff and the rhythms of the estate, and the particular way the afternoon light fell through the library windows. And she learned Charles, which was a slower and more rewarding study than any of the rest. He was a man of few words and consistent action. He did not speak warmly and then behave coldly. He did not make promises and allow them to quietly expire. When he said he would do something, he did it, and when he held a position, he held it under pressure with the same steadiness he held it in comfort. Henrietta, who had spent her adult life navigating a world full of men who performed reliability without practicing it, found this quality in him almost startling in its rarity. They talked in the evenings, first carefully, then with increasing ease, then with the kind of natural frankness that cannot be manufactured or hurried, and which arrives, when it arrives, like a change in weather that you notice only after it has already changed. She told him about her father. Not the accusation, not the politics of it, but the man himself. The way he had read to her as a child from whatever occupied his mind that week. The way he had taken the Oxford friendship seriously enough to write letters for 30 years to a man he saw rarely and loved consistently. The way he had, in his final weeks, held her hand and asked her to believe him, and the way his eyes had looked when she said that she did. Charles listened to all of it, and she saw in his face something that she recognized because she had felt it herself. He was grieving his father. Not freshly, the raw grief had passed, but in the way grief settles into a person and becomes part of their structure, present in everything, named by nothing. They were, she realized, both children doing their best to honor something they had been given without a manual. The dowager remained cold. She was civil, in the way a winter road is passable, technically navigable, but offering no comfort and carrying the constant possibility of giving way. She attended dinner when required. She spoke to Henrietta when spoken to. She did not repeat the drawing room scene, but its echo lived in every interaction, in every moment when she looked at Henrietta and her eyes held the flatness of a woman who has decided in advance what she is looking at and sees no reason to look again. Henrietta bore it. She bore it because she understood, at a level she did not discuss with Charles, that grief which cannot find its proper object will attach itself to the nearest available substitute. The dowager had lost her brother. She had needed someone to hold responsible. History had provided a name, and she had held it for years with both hands, because letting go of it would mean letting go of the certainty that had organized her pain into something bearable. Henrietta could not take that from her by force. She could only continue to be, visibly and consistently, a person who did not deserve the weight of it. The truth arrived in February. It arrived as truth sometimes does, through official channels and in an entirely impersonal form. A British military intelligence officer reviewing captured French regimental documents as part of the post-war archival process following the Congress of Vienna, found among a collection of intercepted correspondence a letter written in English in a woman's hand dated 3 weeks before the Salamanca ambush. The letter had been written by the Dowager Duchess of Dunmore to her husband, the late Duke, who had been in the Iberian Peninsula at the time on a brief diplomatic matter. It was her personal letter, warm and private, the kind a wife writes to a husband she misses. It contained, in the way that personal letters sometimes do, details about people and movements that the writer had not thought of as sensitive, because she had not thought of them as information at all. She had been writing about her brother, about where he was and when he was expected to move and what regiment he rode with, because she missed him and wanted her husband to know she was thinking of George and watching for news of him. The French intelligence officer who intercepted the letter had underlined 3 sentences in red ink. Those 3 sentences, cross-referenced with a second document in the file, a French tactical report on the Salamanca engagement, corresponded precisely to the details of the ambush. The archival officer noted the connection, filed a formal report, and forwarded it to the relevant department in London. The relevant department sent it directly to the Duke of Dunmore, because the original accusation against Lord Bassett remained on official record, and the new evidence was directly exculpatory. Charles read the report alone in his study on a Tuesday morning, and he sat with it for a very long time. He understood what it meant for Lord Bassett's name. He understood what it meant for Henrietta, and he understood, with a clarity that arrived slowly, and then all at once, what it meant for his mother, and what it was going to cost her to receive this information and sit inside it. She had spent years certain of one thing. That certainty had shaped how she grieved, how she lived, and how she had treated the woman her son had married. And that certainty was about to be taken from her and replaced with something far harder to carry. He told Henrietta first. He came to her sitting room and put the report in her hands without preamble and said, "Read this." She read it. She read it twice. She set it down, and her hands were not entirely steady, and she pressed them flat on the table in the way he had noticed she did when she was managing something large and needed a moment to contain it. "My father told the truth," she said. Yes. She was quiet for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, but she did not cry, which was, he thought, very much in keeping with everything he had learned about her. "Your mother?" she said. "Yes." "How will you tell her?" "I had thought," he said carefully, "that we might tell her together." Henrietta looked at him for a long moment. She understood what he was asking. Not for support. He did not need support for a difficult conversation. He was asking her to be present for his mother's reckoning as something other than an absent accusation, as a living person who had the most to forgive and who might, by her presence, make forgiveness possible. "Yes," she said, "together." They found the dowager in the south parlour with her correspondence. She looked up when they entered side by side, and something moved briefly across her face at the sight of them, something that might, under other circumstances, have been called relief. Charles placed the report on the table in front of her and said quietly, "Read this, Mother. All of it." She read it. She read it slowly, in the particular stillness of someone who begins reading one thing and gradually understands they are reading another. They watched the colour leave her face. They watched the document tremble slightly in her hands. They watched the moment when she reached the underlined sentences and the cross-reference and the French tactical report and understood what she was looking at. The sound she made was not a word. It was small and involuntary, and entirely unlike anything Henrietta had heard from her across 4 months of maintained composure. She set the report down, she put both hands over her face, and the Dowager Duchess of Dunmore, who had not flinched publicly in 40 years of social performance, wept. She wept for a long time. Charles sat beside her with his hand on her arm and did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the weeping was not already saying more honestly. Henrietta sat across from her and waited, still, present, without demand. When the weeping had exhausted itself, the dowager lowered her hands. Her face was devastated in the way that faces are devastated when the architecture of a long-held belief has been taken apart brick by brick. She looked at Henrietta, and in her eyes was something that had never been there before. Not warmth, that would come later, in its own time, but recognition, the recognition of a woman seeing, clearly and too late, the face of someone she has wronged. "I stood in your doorway on the night you arrived and told you that you were bought and not chosen," she said. Her voice was a ruin of its former steadiness. "I told half of London that your father's blood was a stain on this house. I pointed at you in front of your own household on the night you arrived as its mistress, and I named you a shame." She stopped. "I have no defence for any of it. I had grief, which is not the same thing." "No," Henrietta said. "It is not." She was quiet for a moment. "But I know what grief does to a person when it has nowhere honest to go. I watched it do it to my father in his final weeks, when he could not clear his name and could not make me understand the full truth of what had happened, and could only ask me to believe him." She looked at the dowager steadily and without coldness. "I believed him. I am asking you to understand why I did. And I am telling you that what happened to your brother was a real tragedy, and that the wrong of it was genuine, even though the blame was misplaced. You were not wrong to grieve. You were only wrong about where to put it." The dowager pressed Henrietta's hand in both of hers and held it without speaking for a long moment. "Your father was a good man," she said at last. "I was wrong, and I am deeply, deeply sorry for what that cost him, and you. The grief, once redirected to its true source, was enormous. The dowager had carried it for years as anger, which is the form grief takes when it has nowhere safe to land, and now the anger had been removed, and what remained was the original loss in its full, unmediated size. She mourned her brother properly for the first time. She spoke of George to Henrietta and to Charles with the particular tenderness of someone finally permitted to remember a person as a person rather than as a wound. She told Henrietta about his laugh, his terrible singing, the way he had written letters that were half news and half nonsense and entirely beloved. She said his name without bracing herself. That alone seemed to loosen something that had been held rigid in her for a very long time. Henrietta listened to every word with the full attention she brought to everything, and she found, in the listening, that she was genuinely glad to know this woman. The cruelty had been grief's instrument, not the dowager's character, and the character, once the grief was no longer weaponized, was formidable and warm and entirely worth knowing. But the grief was also large, and the body, at a certain age and a certain accumulated weight of living, does not always survive the full arrival of what it has been managing at a distance. The dowager's health began to decline in the spring. Quietly at first, in the way that declines begin, a fatigue that sleep did not resolve, a pallor that the warmer weather did not restore. By May it was clear, to her physician, and to everyone in the house, that something was in progress that could not be reversed, only accompanied. Henrietta and Charles accompanied it. Henrietta sat with her in the afternoons, when the light was good, and read to her histories she had loved in younger years, letters from old friends, and sometimes simply the ordinary news of the day, the world continuing its business in the unceremonious way it does, regardless of what is happening inside a particular house. Charles came every morning and often in the evenings, and he held his mother's hand and talked with her about his father, and about the estate, and about the things she needed him to know while she was still able to tell him. In July, on a morning when the roses outside her bedroom window were at their fullest, the dowager asked for them both. They came and sat beside her, one on each side of the bed, and she looked at them with the clarity that sometimes arrives at the end of things when the effort of managing impressions is no longer necessary or possible. She looked at Henrietta for a long time. Then she said, "I gave you a terrible beginning in this house. You answered it better than I deserved." A pause. Charles's father chose wisely when he made that vow, and Charles chose wisely when he honoured it, and you chose wisely to stay when any sensible woman would have made his life considerably more difficult. A faint, exhausted version of what her smile had once been. "I am glad you were stubborn." Henrietta took her hand. "I learned it somewhere," she said quietly. The dowager's smile deepened for a moment. She looked at Charles. "She is going to be formidable," she said. "More than you are, probably." "Almost certainly," Charles agreed. "Good." The dowager closed her eyes. "That is exactly what this family needs." She died the following morning, quietly, in the early light, with the roses visible through the window and the house still around her. She had arranged her own affairs with characteristic precision. She had written letters to the people she loved and made her peace with the ones she had wronged. And she had, in her final weeks, smiled more genuinely and more often than anyone in the household could remember seeing from her before. Henrietta and Charles buried her beside his father in the Dunmore churchyard on a grey July morning with the whole village in attendance, because she had been, under everything, a woman of consequence and presence and genuine local regard. Henrietta stood at Charles's side with her hand in his, and afterward, when the mourners had offered their condolences and moved away, they stood alone together at the graveside, in the particular silence of two people who have been through something together that has permanently changed the shape of the ground between them. "She blessed you," Charles said. "At the end, that mattered to her." "It mattered to me," Henrietta said. He looked at her. The grey skies were beginning to lighten toward the east, the clouds thinning at their edges. He had looked at her many times over the months of their marriage, but there was something different in how he looked at her now. Something that had none of the carefulness of early days, none of the managed distance of two people still learning the terms of a shared life. He looked at her the way you look at something you have stopped assessing and simply value. "My father asked me to honor a vow," he said. "That is how this began. I know. That is not how it continues," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever this is now, between us, it has nothing to do with vows made by other people. It is entirely its own thing." Henrietta looked up at him. She thought of a drawing room and a pointing finger, and the long, careful months of being measured and found wanting. She thought of the report on the table that had taken her father's name out of the dark, and a woman who had wept and asked for forgiveness and received it, and an old grief that had finally been given its true shape and allowed to rest. She thought of evenings in the library and conversations that had started carefully and arrived over time at something that felt less like conversation and more like thinking aloud to someone who understood what you were trying to say before you finished saying it. "I know what it is," she said. "I have known for some time." He took her face in his hands, there in the grey July morning, with the churchyard quiet around them and the village beyond going about its ordinary business, and he kissed her with the uncomplicated, unhurried certainty of a man who has stopped managing what he feels and simply feels it. They walked home through the village in the lightening morning, and the grounds of Dunmore Park received them as they had always been meant to receive them, as the people who belonged there, to the house and to each other. Not because a vow had required it, but because everything that had happened since the vow had built something real and lasting and entirely their own. Lord Bassett's name was formally cleared by the military record that autumn. The announcement was small, a single paragraph in the official gazette, the kind of thing most people would read and set aside without ceremony. Henriette read it at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning, with Charles across from her and the morning light coming through the windows of Dunmore Park in long, unhurried bars of gold. She read it once. She folded the paper and set it down, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she looked up and found Charles watching her with the expression she had come to know best in him, steady, quiet, completely present. "He knew," she said. "He always knew the truth would find its way out." "Yes," Charles said, "and so did you." She nodded. She picked up her cup. Outside the windows, the grounds lay still and golden in the autumn light, and the house around them was warm and unhurried. And the only announcement that had ever truly mattered was the one that had been made quietly in a drawing-room doorway on the night of her arrival, not by the dowager, not by society, but by a man who had set down a glass and stepped forward and said, with his presence rather than his words, that he had chosen her, not bought, not arranged, not transacted, chosen every single day through every difficult thing, with the full knowledge of who she was and where she had come from and what it would cost. That was what she was, and it turned out to be enough, more than enough. It turned out to be everything. Now, before you go, I want to ask you something simple. What time of day did this story find you? Was it a quiet morning, the rest of the world not yet started? A late night when everything had finally gone still, and this was the last thing you gave your attention to before you rested? Or somewhere in the middle of the day, a few minutes that were entirely yours? Tell me in the comments below, and tell me how your day was going when this story found you, because I have come to believe that stories arrive at exactly the moment they are supposed to. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Regency Romance Vault and hit the notification bell. A new story comes every day. See you tomorrow.